She was standing on a rooftop 40 floors above Manhattan, wearing an emerald dress she had chosen with intention, when a hand reached out and tore it from her body. Not by accident, not in a moment of carelessness, with purpose. Serena Blake-Yoon, a Black woman who had built everything she had from nothing, who had walked into every room that was not designed for her and made it forget that fact, stood on that terrace with the silk torn from her waist down, her golden clutch shattered on the marble floor, and 3 people laughing at her like she was exactly what they had always believed she was. Nothing. One of them raised a phone, ready to film, ready to post, ready to make sure the whole world saw what they saw when they looked at her. And Serena did not run, did not scream, did not beg. She looked directly into that camera with the calmest, most devastating eyes any of them had ever seen, and said 7 words that made Britney's thumb freeze above the screen. What those 3 people did not know, what they could not have imagined in their worst nightmares, was that 40 feet away, on the other side of a glass door, a man in a black suit with a dragon tattooed up his neck had just heard everything. His name was Yoon Jae-hyun, and the woman in the torn emerald dress was his wife. They thought they had humiliated someone who was alone. They had no idea what was already walking through that door. Before starting the story, comment down below where you are watching from and what time it is there. If stories of karma, love, and hidden truths move you, leave a like, be sure to subscribe to the channel, and click join to become a member and help our channel. There is a kind of silence that exists only at the top of things. Not the silence of emptiness, the silence of selection. Of rooms where every face was chosen, every voice pre-approved, every body permitted. The rooftop. Obsidian wore that silence like a second skin on the night of the Cheolhyeoldan's annual gathering, draped in amber light and the low murmur of people who had long ago learned that real power never needed to raise its voice. She walked in wearing emerald. Serena Blake-Yoon had dressed that morning the way she always dressed for rooms like this one, with intention. The silk was heavy and deliberate, the color chosen because it refused to be ignored. She had spent 15 years learning how to enter spaces that were not designed for her and make them forget, at least temporarily, that they had not been. She had done it in design school when she was the only one. She had done it in boardrooms when she was the youngest. She had done it in galleries and showrooms and editorial meetings, and she would do it here, in this rooftop above Manhattan, where the city glittered 40 floors below like a thing that could be owned. What no one in that room understood, what no one ever understood about Serena, was that the composure was not armor. It was archaeology. Layers upon layers of a girl from Atlanta who had learned, very young, that excellence was not enough to make people see you as belonging. That excellence, in the wrong room, could make you a threat instead of a peer. She had buried that girl so carefully, so thoroughly, that even she sometimes forgot she was still carrying her. She found her husband near the far railing and walked to him the way water finds its level. Naturally, inevitably. He was already watching her when she arrived. He was always already watching her. He placed his hand at the small of her back and said something low in Korean that made the edge of her mouth lift. And to anyone observing, and many were observing, because they always observed Jae-hyun, because you watched things that frightened you. It looked like any elegant couple exchanging pleasantries at an elegant event. What it was, in truth, was 2 people who had each survived entirely different kinds of war, quietly choosing again to survive together. The evening moved the way such evenings move, handshakes with weight behind them, laughter calibrated to the listener. Serena spoke with 3 clients, deflected 2 condescending questions about her background in design with the particular smile she reserved for condescension, and accepted a glass of champagne she would not finish. Jae-hyun moved beside her, or near her, never far. He had not told her about the envelope. He had decided, with the specific arrogance of a man accustomed to solving problems before they became her problems, that she did not need to know. This was the thing about him that she had loved and feared in equal measure since the beginning. His certainty that protection and control were this same gesture. And across the room, in the particular way that trouble always arranges itself at these kinds of gatherings, 3 people had been watching Serena since she walked in. Not with admiration, not with the polite curiosity that wealth sometimes manufactures to disguise its prejudice, but with the specific, sour attention of people who had decided, before she took her second step through that door, that something was wrong with her presence, that something needed correcting. They did not know who she was married to. They did not think it mattered. This is the part of the story where everything that follows becomes inevitable. Not because anyone planned it, but because certain attitudes, left unchecked in certain rooms, always find their moment. Always locate the nearest exit to someone else's dignity and walk straight through it. The night was still early. The city below still glittered. And Serena Blake-Yoon, unaware of what was already moving toward her in the amber light of the rooftop obsidian, touched her husband's arm once and slipped quietly toward the outer terrace. She needed 10 minutes away from the performance of it all. She had earned 10 minutes. The outer terrace was the kind of place that existed to be escaped to. Smaller than the main rooftop, lined with low planters of dark olive trees that someone had paid a great deal of money to make look effortless, lit by recessed amber bulbs that turned everything they touched into something warmer than it actually was. The city noise rose from below in that muffled, distant way that made Manhattan feel, from 40 floors up, like something happening to someone else. Serena stood at the railing and let herself exhale for the first time since the elevator doors had opened. She did not hear them follow her. This is the thing about people who carry cruelty casually. They move quietly because they have never had to account for the weight of what they carry. Marcus Holt had spent 34 years in rooms that validated him before he spoke. Derek Paulson had spent 31 years borrowing that validation and mistaking it for his own. And Brittany Caldwell had learned, somewhere along the way, that the fastest path to belonging in rooms like this one was to locate whoever belonged least and make it visible. They came through the terrace door, laughing at something that had nothing to do with Serena. But the moment they saw her, alone, her back to them, the emerald dress catching the amber light, the laughter shifted, recalibrated, became something with an edge to it. Brittany spoke first, because she always spoke first. Her voice carried the particular sweetness of someone who had practiced making venom sound like observation. She said what she said, and Serena heard it, and did not turn immediately. She stood at that railing with the whole glittering city below her, and she breathed through the familiar heat that moved through her chest. Not surprise, never surprise, but the exhausting, bone-deep recognition of a thing she had hoped this time she would not have to feel. She answered them, calmly, precisely, with the specific economy of a woman who had learned that over-explaining herself to people like this was a form of surrender. And she turned to leave. What no one on that terrace understood, what Brittany Caldwell could not have understood, because understanding it would have required her to see Serena as fully human, was that the act of turning away was not weakness. It was a woman choosing, for the 10,000th time in her life, not to give her energy to something beneath her. It was discipline. It was grace. It was a decision made in a fraction of a second from a reservoir of self-possession that had taken decades to build. Brittany's hand moved faster than the decision behind it. The sound the silk made when it tore was very small. That is the thing no one who wasn't there would ever quite believe. That something so violent, so deliberate, so irreversible, made such a small sound. A whisper of fabric. A single note. And then Serena's hand was at the railing and her sandal was against the marble and the golden clutch was opening on the floor like a broken sentence. The snake clasp her husband had given her spinning once before going still. Marcus laughed. Derek laughed louder, the way people laugh when they are following someone else's lead and need to prove they belong to it. Brittany raised the phone, and Serena stood up straight. This is the moment that would stay with everyone who witnessed it long after everything else had faded. Not what came after. Not the reckoning. Not the 3 figures on their knees with the city behind them. But this. The moment between the tearing and the response. The moment Serena gathered the silk in her hands, found her footing on the marble, and turned to face the phone's camera with an expression so composed, so completely without panic, that it stopped Brittany's thumb above the screen. It was not the face of a woman who had been broken. It was the face of a woman who had been broken before. Long before this terrace, long before this night, and had rebuilt herself so many times that she no longer feared the breaking. She looked at the camera and said what she said quietly, with the absolute certainty of someone who could already see further down the road than anyone else on that terrace. And 40 feet away, on the other side of a glass door, a man in a black suit with a dragon climbing his neck touched the earpiece at his collar once and went completely still. Dong-soo had heard everything. There is a particular kind of man who has spent his entire life being underestimated by people who confused his silence for absence. Yoon Jae-hyun crossed the main rooftop in 11 seconds. He knew because he counted. Not from anxiety, but from the specific discipline of a man who had learned, very early, that emotion unregulated was a liability, and that the most dangerous thing he could do in any moment of crisis was move faster than his thinking. 11 seconds from Dong-soo's signal to the terrace door. Long enough to know what he was walking into. Not long enough for anything on that terrace to change before he arrived. He opened the door the way he opened every door, without urgency, without announcement, as though the space on the other side had already belonged to him before he entered it. His eyes moved across the scene in the way a cartographer reads a landscape. Not emotionally, not yet, but precisely. The torn silk. The clutch on the floor. The phone still raised in Brittany's hand, screen lit, thumb frozen. The 3 of them arranged in the loose, thoughtless formation of people who had not yet registered that the coordinates of their evening had just shifted entirely. And Serena, standing with the city at her back and the torn dress held at her side with one hand, not covering herself with it, but simply holding it, the way you hold something that belonged to you that someone else has damaged. Her chin was level, her shoulders were back. She had not moved toward the door when it opened. She had simply turned her eyes to him, and in them he read everything she would never say out loud in a room like this. The exhaustion, the recognition, the old familiar weight of it. And beneath all of that, buried where only he knew to look, the girl from Atlanta who was still, after all these years, waiting to see if someone would finally stay. He crossed to her, placed his hand against her face, not to comfort her in front of them, not as performance, but because it was the only thing his body knew to do in that moment that was not the other thing. His thumb found her jaw. His eyes found hers. He asked if she was all right. She told him she was. She said his name the way she always said it when she needed him to hear what she wasn't saying. And what she wasn't saying was, "Don't become something I can't follow you back from." He heard it. He always heard it. He turned. And this is the moment that Marcus Holt would describe differently every time he told the story afterward, in the years when he still had the kind of evenings where stories got told. Sometimes he would say the man was terrifying from the first second. Sometimes he would say he seemed almost calm, almost reasonable, until suddenly he wasn't. But the truth that lived in the part of Marcus that he would never say out loud to anyone, was that Yoon Jae-hyun was most frightening precisely because he remained calm all the way through. There was no transition, no escalation. He was controlled at the beginning and controlled at the end, and the punishment arrived not as an explosion, but as a door closing. Quiet, final, without appeal. He said Marcus's name before Marcus had given it. He said Richard Holt's name. He said Chicago. He said contracts and financing and 3 intermediary holdings and a lease renewal. And he said each thing in the same unvarying tone that a man uses when he is not threatening, but simply narrating, simply describing the geography of a situation that the other person had not realized they were already standing inside. Derek stepped back. His heel caught the edge of a planter, and he caught himself against the railing with both hands, and the city yawned below him 40 floors down. And for one vertiginous second, he understood, in his body, if not yet in his mind, the specific terror of having miscalculated the altitude of the place you were standing. Brittany's phone hand dropped. The screen went dark against her thigh. Jae-hyun looked at all 3 of them with the patience of a man who had already decided the outcome and was simply allowing the room to catch up. He told them what would happen next. He said it without raising his voice. He said it the way you state a fact about weather, not cruelly, not with satisfaction, but with the complete absence of doubt that is more frightening than cruelty has ever managed to be. And Marcus Holt, who had spent 34 years in rooms that told him he was untouchable, felt his knees go before the hand even reached his shoulder. The marble was cold. The city was indifferent. And Serena Blake-Yoon stood in a torn emerald dress and watched 3 people discover, far too late, the precise cost of deciding that she was alone. There is something that happens to a person when they watch justice arrive in a form they never expected. It is not simple. It does not feel the way films suggest it feels, clean and bright and closing like a chapter. It feels, in truth, more like standing in a room where the temperature has suddenly changed and not being certain whether to call it warmth or just the absence of cold. Serena stood on that terrace with 3 people on their knees before her, and the whole glittering indifference of Manhattan spread behind them. And what moved through her was not triumph. What moved through her was older than that, heavier. The specific gravity of a woman who has waited her entire life for a moment like this, and finds, when it finally arrives, that it does not undo the waiting. She spoke to them, not because Jae-hyun had arranged it, not because she needed the audience, but because she had carried the words for years, and they deserved to be said out loud at least once to people who had no choice but to hear them. She told them what they had done. Not just tonight. Tonight was the smallest version of it. She told them what their kind of casual, comfortable cruelty had done to girls in school hallways, and women in boardrooms, and human beings in every room that had ever been designed to make certain people feel like guests in their own excellence. She told them without raising her voice. She told them the way you tell the truth when you have finally stopped hoping the telling of it will change the people you're telling it to, and have decided instead to say it for yourself, for the girl from Atlanta, for every version of her that had swallowed this exact thing in exactly this kind of room, and smiled, and continued, and never said a word. Marcus stared at the marble. Derek had gone the color of old wax. Brittany was crying in the particular way of someone who has confused being caught with being sorry, and Serena looked at her for a long moment and felt nothing that resembled pity, and did not pretend otherwise. When she finished, the terrace was very quiet. Jae-hyun had not moved from where he stood. He was watching her the way he watched very few things in his life, not with the calculating attention he gave to problems, but with the open, undefended attention he reserved for things he knew he did not fully deserve. He had built an empire on the precise measurement of what things cost. He understood, standing on that terrace in the amber light with the city far below, that what he was watching could not be measured. That Serena Blake-Yoon had just done something that required more courage than anything he had ever ordered anyone to do in 7 years of absolute authority. She had been vulnerable out loud, in front of people who had tried to use her vulnerability against her. She had taken the thing they had meant as a wound and turned it into a testimony. He had sent men into rooms to collect debts. He had never watched anyone collect a debt like that. The next morning, he burned the envelope. Not because the threat had passed. He did not yet know that it had. But because he understood, in the particular way that transformative nights clarify certain things, that he had been holding it as a reminder that she was a liability. And she was not a liability. She was the only thing in his carefully constructed world that was entirely real. And he had been treating the reality of her like a weakness instead of the only solid ground he had ever stood on. He came back to bed, and she was already half awake, and she asked him why he hadn't slept, and he told her something that was almost the truth. She said his name in the dark, the way she always said it. And he lay beside her and looked at the ceiling and felt, for the first time in longer than he could precisely locate, something that was not strategy, not calculation, not the management of outcomes, just the plain, unarmored fact of loving someone. In the weeks that followed, things shifted for 3 people in ways they could not trace to a single source. Contracts reviewed. Partnerships quietly dissolved. A phone backup that simply, inexplicably, no longer existed. None of it arrived with a signature. None of it came with an explanation. This was the nature of the kind of power Jae-hyun operated. It did not announce itself because it did not need to. It moved the way water moves through stone, not with force, but with patience, with the absolute confidence of something that has all the time in the world. But the thing that stayed, the thing that none of the consequences, none of the deliberate and invisible reckoning could account for or replace, was what Serena had said on that terrace in her torn emerald dress. Because that had not been his power. That had been entirely hers. And it had landed in a way that no dissolution of a contract, no canceled partnership, no corrupted backup file could replicate or rival. She had made them hear her. And some mornings, in the quiet of the apartment before the city remembered to be loud, Jae-hyun would look at his wife across a breakfast table and think about the envelope, and the photograph, and the words written by someone who believed that loving her made him weak. He would think about 3 people on cold marble, with New York burning behind them. and he would think that whoever had sent that envelope had been right about one thing. She was his point of vulnerability. The one place in his architecture that had no reinforcement, no contingency, no secondary measure. He had simply decided that some things were worth being vulnerable for. And Serena, who never knew about the envelope, who never knew about the photograph, who never knew how carefully and invisibly the walls around her had been rebuilt that night. Serena would look up from her coffee sometimes and find him watching her with that expression she had no precise name for. And she would hold his gaze for a moment before looking back down. She always looked back down smiling. Not because she needed him, but because, after a lifetime of being the only person willing to fight for herself in every room she entered, it turned out that not being alone felt like something she hadn't known she was allowed to want. The city moved below them. The dress was replaced. The terrace existed somewhere above Manhattan, amber lit and empty now, the marble clean, the planters undisturbed, the railing holding nothing but air. And somewhere in Atlanta, a girl who had once cried in a school bathroom because a party door had closed in her face was, without knowing it, finally, quietly, at rest. If you have ignored signs, accepted less than you deserved, or stayed too long in confusing situations, this may be the moment to change that. Today, access is available for just $9.90 instead of $67. But this promotional offer is temporary. The link is below. If this story moved you, stop for a moment and reflect. Have you ever walked into a room and felt like the space itself was telling you that you did not belong there? Not because of anything you had done, but simply because of who you are? Have you ever had to be twice as strong, twice as composed, twice as silent about your pain, just to be seen as half as worthy? And if someone had finally chosen to stand beside you, not because you were weak, but simply because you deserved not to stand alone, would you have known how to let them? Tell us your experiences and feelings in the comments. We read them all. And if you believe in stories about dignity, justice, and the kind of love that refuses to let you carry everything alone, leave a like, be sure to subscribe to the channel, and click Join to become a part of our community and help the channel.